Why would a country shoot first and explain nothing on the exact same night a ship was set on fire less than 200 miles away? Tonight, somewhere over Iran, a plane fell out of the sky, and nobody is saying whose it was. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this one move fast, sometimes within hours, and you don't want to be the last person to know what happened next. If this video helps you understand the region better than the headlines do, give it a like right now. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. Now let's get into it. Late at night, without warning, the sky over a small area in southern Iran lit up. 4 explosions ripped through the darkness, one after another, loud enough that people on the ground felt them before they understood them. Within minutes, phones were buzzing. Messages were flying. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What just happened up there? The first guess, the one that spread fastest, was that the United States had struck again. That theory made sense on the surface. This exact region had already seen heavy strikes earlier in the broader conflict, so when new blasts echoed across the same skies, people assumed the same hand was behind them. They were wrong. As more details came out, a very different picture started forming. This wasn't an attack coming into Iran. It was Iran firing outward. Iranian air defense systems had locked onto something in their own airspace and brought it down. An aircraft, still unidentified, was now scattered across the ground in pieces. And that's where the real mystery begins. Whose plane was it? Before we go any further into the wreckage itself, it's worth pausing on something simple but important. Iran doesn't shoot things out of its own sky casually. Its air defense network is built around layers of radar, missile batteries, and strict rules of engagement that usually require some level of confirmation before a trigger gets pulled. For that system to fire and fire successfully enough to bring down a real aircraft, something crossed a line serious enough to justify an immediate response. Whatever that aircraft was doing, Iranian commanders on the ground believed it was dangerous enough to destroy first and ask questions later. Videos began circulating almost immediately, showing twisted metal, broken fuselage, and wreckage spread across open ground. No clear markings, no obvious flag. No confirmation from anyone. Analysts pored over every frame, every angle, every scrap of metal, trying to find something, anything, that would point to an answer. Some early theories pointed toward Saudi Arabia, suggesting the aircraft might have been a reconnaissance drone, possibly built in China, flying a surveillance mission near Iranian territory. Nothing about that has been confirmed. No country has stepped forward and claimed the wreckage as its own. Iran hasn't released a technical breakdown either. What we're left with is silence from every side that would actually know the truth. But here's the one thing experts do seem confident about. Almost every available detail suggests this wasn't an American aircraft. And that detail matters enormously. If this had been a United States asset, the fallout would have been immediate, loud, and impossible to contain, especially with relations between Washington and Tehran already stretched to the breaking point. Instead, the world is left with an unclaimed wreck and a government in Tehran that isn't explaining itself. Think about what that silence actually tells us. Iran isn't projecting calm right now. It's projecting the opposite. Its air defense systems are on a hair trigger, ready to shoot down anything unidentified that enters what it considers sensitive airspace. No questions asked first. That's not the posture of a country trying to de-escalate. That's the posture of a country that has decided shooting first is worth the risk of getting it wrong. Now, if this had happened in isolation, one strange incident in one contested sky, it might have faded from the news cycle within a day. But it didn't happen in isolation. On that very same night, somewhere else entirely, a completely different kind of fire was burning. This time, it wasn't in the air, it was on the water. Reports started coming in that a tanker believed to be carrying oil had been hit and was now burning in the Strait of Hormuz. Footage showed massive flames climbing off the deck, thick black smoke rising high enough to be seen from a distance, and a ship that appeared to be losing large sections of its structure to the fire. The strike reportedly happened near a port on the Omani side of the strait, placing it directly inside one of the busiest and most closely watched shipping corridors on the entire planet. If you don't follow global trade closely, here's why that location matters so much. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just another patch of ocean. It's one of the tightest choke points in the world for oil shipments. A massive share of the planet's daily petroleum supply has to pass through that narrow stretch of water to reach the rest of the world. When something goes wrong there, it doesn't stay a local story. It moves oil prices. It raises insurance costs for every tanker in the region. It puts pressure on countries that depend on that route for their fuel. To put the scale of that corridor in perspective, ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz aren't just carrying fuel for nearby countries. They're feeding energy markets on almost every continent, from factories in Asia to power plants in Europe. When a single tanker catches fire in those waters, it isn't just a maritime accident. It's a disruption that ripples outward through global supply chains within hours, long before most people watching the news even understand what happened. Every crew member on every ship still moving through that strait tonight knows this history. They know the risk isn't theoretical anymore. It's sitting right there in the water with them, every single crossing. And this wasn't a first. Ships have been targeted in these waters before, more than once, and each new incident makes it harder to pretend these are just unlucky, unconnected events. This narrow stretch of sea has quietly become one of the most dangerous shipping lanes on Earth, even though no country has formally declared war on the vessels crossing it. What makes this particular strike so unsettling is the timing. It happened the same night as the jet shootdown. Two separate crises, two completely different domains, sky and sea, both erupting within hours of each other. When you see that kind of overlap, experts who study these patterns will tell you it's rarely a coincidence. It usually signals something bigger shifting underneath the surface, not two isolated strokes of bad luck happening to land on the same night. Picture the challenge this creates for anyone responsible for protecting that waterway. Naval forces, coast guards, private security teams, they now have to watch the sky and the water at the same time, because a threat could come from either direction without warning. That kind of pressure doesn't just make the job harder. It makes mistakes more likely, and mistakes in a region this tense can spiral quickly. And once again, nobody has claimed responsibility for the ship attack. In past incidents like this, armed groups in the region have often rushed to take credit, using the attack itself as a kind of political statement. This time, there's been nothing. No claim, no statement, no group stepping forward. That silence leaves a vacuum, and into that vacuum pours speculation, fear, and a kind of uncertainty that's almost worse than knowing who did it. For the people actually working on these ships, this isn't some abstract geopolitical puzzle. It's their daily reality. Every crossing through that strait now carries a real chance of fire, explosion, or worse. Insurance companies are already recalculating the risk of sending vessels through that corridor, and those costs don't just disappear. They eventually show up somewhere down the line, in the price of goods that most people never connect back to a burning ship near the Strait of Hormuz. If you're starting to see how these pieces connect, drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story concerns you the most. I read through these, and it helps me understand what you want covered next. So step back for a second and look at both of these events side by side. A plane with no confirmed owner, shot down over Iranian soil, a tanker in flames in one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet. Same night, same region. No official explanations from anyone involved. That alone should tell you this region is under more pressure than most people realize. But to really understand why Iran is behaving this way right now, you have to look past the explosions and the burning wreckage and look instead at what's happening quietly inside the walls of power in Tehran. Something significant just shifted there. Iran's newly installed supreme leader has handed a major security post to one of the country's most experienced and hardline figures, a man with deep, long-standing ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He's now been placed as a direct representative inside the country's top national security body, the group responsible for shaping how Iran responds to exactly these kinds of crises. This isn't a minor bureaucratic reshuffle. This man has decades of history inside the Revolutionary Guard, including a senior role during one of the most brutal wars Iran has ever fought. His name carries weight. His instincts, by every account, lean firmly toward confrontation rather than compromise. When a country's top leadership places someone with that exact background into the room where security decisions get made, it's not a subtle signal, it's a clear one. And the changes didn't stop there. Iran's president has separately backed this same figure for another powerful role within that same Security Council, after the previous official in that position stepped aside. Two of the most powerful people in the country, both pointing the same influential figure toward the center of national security decision-making, all while multiple crises are unfolding at once in the air, at sea, and beyond. For anyone trying to understand where this is heading, that timing matters enormously. Governments don't usually promote hardliners into critical security roles during a moment of high tension by accident. It's almost always a deliberate signal, both to the outside world and to the government's own institutions, that the mood inside is hardening, not softening. It also helps to understand what this particular figure represents inside Iran's political system. The Revolutionary Guard isn't just another branch of the military. It operates almost like a parallel power structure with its own economic interests, its own intelligence networks, and its own deeply held worldview shaped by decades of conflict and confrontation. When someone from that world moves into a top security seat, they don't leave that worldview behind. They bring it directly into the room where decisions about war, peace, and everything in between actually get made. The context alone should tell you a lot about which direction Iran's next moves are likely to lean. That shift lines up with what Iranian officials have actually been saying out loud recently. One advisor closely tied to the parliament's leadership stated plainly that Iran isn't expecting any kind of understanding with the current American administration, and instead plans to simply wait out its term. That's not the language of a government preparing for negotiation. That's the language of a government digging in for a long standoff. Iran's foreign minister has echoed a similar tone specifically when discussing the Strait of Hormuz, insisting that any return to normal shipping through that corridor depends entirely on what Iran considers a rollback of ongoing military actions from the United States and its allies. Until that happens, Iranian officials are making clear that they intend to keep tight control over that waterway, and anyone who tries to move through it without playing by their rules risks becoming a target. Put all of that together, the picture becomes much clearer. A hardline figure now sits inside the country's most sensitive security discussions. Multiple senior voices are openly dismissing any near-term chance of diplomacy with Washington, and Iran's public stance on one of the most critical waterways on Earth remains rigid, backed not by offers of compromise, but by open threats. Before we go further into just how far this tension actually spreads across the region, take a second to hit that like button if this is helping you connect the dots here, because there's a lot more to this story than just one shot-down aircraft and one burning ship. Because here's the thing, these two incidents, as serious as they are on their own, are actually just two visible pieces of a much larger picture stretching across the entire region. According to a report from an Israeli public broadcaster, officials from one country reportedly advised officials in another to pursue a temporary understanding with Israel. Not real peace, not genuine cooperation. A tactical pause, designed specifically to lower Israeli vigilance for a while, only to break that arrangement later once preparations for a bigger confrontation were fully in place. Because of reporting restrictions, the countries involved couldn't be named publicly. But think about what that suggests. This isn't a story about diplomacy working. It's a story about diplomacy being used as a disguise, a way to buy time while quietly preparing for something far more serious. Analysts looking at this report point to two likely candidates. Iran fits the pattern given its long history of hostility toward Israel. But Syria fits too, a country that has often kept a calm public face toward its neighbors, while very different things may be happening beneath the surface. That suspicion grew stronger after a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Syria claimed it had launched drones and rockets at an Israeli position near the Syrian border. The claim spread mostly through channels linked to Hezbollah and supporters of the Syrian government, and it hasn't been independently verified. But whether or not this specific claim turns out to be fully accurate, it adds one more entry to a growing list of shadowy, unofficial strikes happening across the region, and it points to something bigger. More and more armed groups are becoming willing to test Israel openly, rather than staying quiet in the background. And it isn't only happening with missiles and drones. A completely different kind of battlefield has opened up as well, one that doesn't involve a single explosion. The United Arab Emirates has publicly acknowledged that it's facing a coordinated wave of cyber attacks aimed at its aviation, energy, and education sectors. Officials say their defenses are actively catching and blocking these intrusions. But the fact that such critical high-value systems are being targeted at all tells you how many different fronts this regional standoff has actually opened. This isn't just about missiles and tankers anymore. It's about digital attacks capable of disrupting daily life without a single shot being fired. Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, Houthi forces have resumed their own campaign, launching ballistic missiles and drones toward a port associated with Saudi military activity. The group claims their targets were troop positions and ammunition storage sites nearby. This fits a pattern the Houthis have followed for a long time now, showing both the intent and the growing capability to strike shipping lanes and military targets far beyond their home territory in Yemen. It's worth understanding why the Houthis keep choosing this particular strategy, because it isn't random. Yemen doesn't have the conventional military strength to challenge Saudi Arabia or its allies directly on a battlefield. What it does have is geography, sitting right along one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth, and a willingness to use drones and missiles as a way to punch far above its actual military weight. By threatening ships and ports far from its own borders, the group forces much larger, wealthier nations to spend enormous resources on defense and interception, all without ever having to win a traditional war. It's a strategy built entirely around making the cost of ignoring them too high to bear. In response to all of this, the United States has continued reinforcing its presence in the region. Airborne surveillance aircraft have been repositioned to strengthen coverage. Fighter squadrons remain actively patrolling the skies, and along the maritime blockade already in place, the numbers tell their own story. Dozens of commercial ships have been turned back after warnings alone. A handful that ignored those warnings have been disabled outright. Others have been boarded and inspected to confirm they're following the rules. When you step back and look at absolutely everything happening at once, it stops looking like a string of unlucky, disconnected headlines. An unidentified aircraft shot down over Iranian soil. A tanker burning in one of the most important waterways on the planet. A hardliner elevated into the center of Iran's national security decisions. A reported strategy of fake diplomacy aimed at lowering Israel's guard. Claimed strikes launching from inside Syria. Cyber attacks hitting critical infrastructure in the UAE. Missiles and drones fired from Yemen towards Saudi-linked targets. and a steady, visible buildup of American military assets across the entire region. Any single one of these stories, taken completely on its own, might get written off as a contained, isolated incident, but look at all of them together, happening within the same tight window of time, and a very different picture starts to form. This region isn't easing toward calm right now. It's absorbing pressure from almost every direction at once, and each new front adds more weight to a situation that already felt fragile before any of this even started. If this kind of full picture breakdown is something you actually want more of, share this video with someone who only sees the scattered headlines and never the connections between them. That's genuinely the best way to help this channel keep doing this kind of reporting. Let's talk for a moment about why nobody is claiming responsibility for any of this, because that silence is louder than it looks. In past regional conflicts, armed groups often rush to announce their involvement in an attack, treating it as a form of propaganda, a way to build their reputation among supporters. This time, across almost every incident we've covered tonight, that pattern is broken. No formal claims, no proud announcements, just wreckage, fire, and silence. Compare that to how these conflicts usually play out. In earlier phases of tension across the same region, groups would sometimes claim an attack within hours, releasing statements, photos, even short videos meant to prove their involvement. That kind of public claim served a purpose. It built credibility with supporters, sent a message to enemies, and shaped the narrative before anyone else could. The fact that this pattern has quietly disappeared around these two specific incidents suggests something has changed in how these operations are being planned, and possibly who's actually directing them from behind the scenes. It raises an uncomfortable possibility, too, that the people responsible are more concerned with keeping their options open than with scoring points, which is often a sign that something larger is still being decided behind closed doors. That silence could mean a few different things, and it's worth sitting with all of them. It could mean whoever's responsible doesn't want to trigger a direct, obvious retaliation by publicly admitting involvement. It could mean multiple parties are involved and nobody wants to take sole ownership of what might come next. Or it could mean something even more unsettling, that these actions are being coordinated quietly, deliberately, kept ambiguous, so that no single government can be blamed cleanly enough to justify an immediate, overwhelming response. Whatever the actual reason turns out to be, that ambiguity is dangerous in its own right. Wars and major conflicts rarely start with countries fully understanding who did what. They often start with confusion, mistaken assumptions, and leaders who feel forced to respond to something they can't fully verify. An unclaimed shootdown and an unclaimed tanker fire happening on the same night, inside a region this volatile, is exactly the kind of ambiguity that can turn a tense standoff into something far worse, almost overnight. Now, let's think honestly about where this actually goes from here, because that's the question that matters most. There are really only two paths this can follow. One possibility is that this becomes part of a long, grinding pattern, the kind we've already seen play out for months. Occasional strikes, unclaimed wreckage, tense statements from officials, tight control over shipping lanes, a slow, exhausting standoff that never fully explodes, but never fully cools down either. There's actually historical precedent for standoffs like this dragging on far longer than most outside observers expect. Regions locked in this kind of simmering tension can sometimes hold that uneasy balance for years, with each side testing limits just enough to send a message, but stopping just short of the kind of action that would force an undeniable large-scale response. It's an exhausting, expensive way to exist, but it is sustainable, at least for a while, especially when every government involved has strong reasons to avoid being the one blamed for starting something bigger. The other possibility is more serious. At some point, one of these unclaimed incidents lands on the wrong target or gets misread by the wrong government, and suddenly this stops being a pattern of managed tension and becomes something that's very difficult to walk back. Nobody wants that outcome. But wanting to avoid it and actually avoiding it are two very different things, especially when so many different armed groups, intelligence services, and militaries are all operating in the same tight space at the same time. What we do know for certain is this: Iran just placed a hardliner directly inside its most sensitive security discussions. Iranian officials are openly stating they don't expect any understanding with Washington anytime soon. The country's foreign minister has drawn a hard line on the Strait of Hormuz, refusing any flexibility until specific demands are met. And all of this is happening while unidentified aircraft are being shot out of the sky and tankers are burning in open water, with absolutely nobody willing to say out loud who's actually responsible. That combination, hardline leadership, rigid public demands, and an expanding web of unclaimed attacks is not a recipe for things quietly calming down. It's a recipe for more nights like this one, more unexplained wreckage, more burning ships, and more silence from every side that actually knows what's going on. There's also a broader lesson buried in all of this that's easy to miss if you're only watching one headline at a time. Regions like this one rarely collapse into full-scale war in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they erode slowly through exactly this kind of accumulation. A shootdown here, a tanker fire there, a leadership change that hardens the government's posture, a cyber attack that quietly tests another country's defenses. None of these events alone forces a massive response. But stacked together, night after night, they build a kind of pressure that eventually has to go somewhere. History has shown over and over that this is usually how major conflicts actually begin. Not with one clear act of war, but with a long chain of smaller incidents that nobody wanted to be the one to escalate first. Until eventually, somebody does. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this stays a slow, simmering standoff, the kind that drags on for months without a clear breaking point? Or do you think we're watching the early stages of something that eventually forces a much bigger, much louder response from somewhere in this story? And which piece of tonight's puzzle worries you the most? The shootdown, the burning tanker, or the quiet power shift happening inside Tehran? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I promise you, this isn't the last unclaimed wreck we're going to be talking about. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most casual news scrollers completely miss. These stories are never really separate. The plane, the tanker, the leadership reshuffle, the cyber attacks, the missiles fired from Yemen, they're all threads in the exact same tightening knot. Subscribe if you want to keep following that knot as it pulls tighter. Because based on everything happening right now, tonight almost certainly won't be the last night like this one. It's easy to watch a story like this one and file it away as just another headline from a part of the world that always seems to be in some kind of crisis. But that kind of thinking is exactly what allows these situations to build undetected until they suddenly can't be ignored anymore. The people living near that stretch of coastline, the sailors crossing that strait every single day, the families in Tehran wondering what their government's next move might cost them, none of them have the luxury of scrolling past this story. For them, every one of these unclaimed incidents is a real immediate risk, not a passing headline. History has a strange habit of hiding its biggest turning points inside its quietest, most confusing nights. No government claiming responsibility, no clear enemy to point to, just wreckage on the ground, fire on the water, and a room full of officials, somewhere deciding what happens next without ever fully explaining themselves to the rest of the world. That's usually how the real story starts, not with a loud declaration, but with silence that says more than words ever could. Look back at almost any major regional conflict in recent memory, and you'll find the same pattern buried somewhere in its early chapters. A confusing incident nobody fully explained. A leadership change that seemed routine at the time but wasn't. A handful of unclaimed attacks that got treated as background noise until, in hindsight, they turned out to be exactly the moment everything started shifting. We won't know for certain which category tonight falls into for some time, but that uncertainty is precisely why it deserves your attention now, while it's still unfolding, rather than months from now when the full picture finally becomes impossible to ignore. We'll be watching every single development as it unfolds, breaking it down honestly, without the noise and without the guesswork dressed up as certainty. And I'll see you in the next one.